So the question that I want to start with is one that I think some of us might answer differently than others, and that question is all life sacred? And that question can take us into a number of conversations, but the one that I want to have today is about killing animals. So how would we answer the question, is it okay for us to kill animals? Is it okay for us to kill them for food? I think there are a number of us who would say, yeah, that's fine, it's not a problem. But what about killing animals for sport? Would we answer that question differently? Does that cross a different line? This question about the sanctity of life is one that some colleagues of mine were wrestling with when they were working on water management for the Glen Canyon Dam in the southwestern United States. For some Native American tribes, this area is the spiritual center of the universe, and killing animals is forbidden. Well, fishing is a huge part of the economy there. And so in trying to develop strategies for managing this area, that would mean that fishing is off the table. So the key was to try to engage all the stakeholders in dialogue, find a way to have that dialogue so that we could come up with palatable solutions. And so in that case, they did come up with solutions. And those solutions were in minimizing the number of fish killed and treating animals with respect after death. And so I think that most of us would agree that images like these don't signify treating animals with respect after death. And so here we have a nameless hunter who has just shot an elephant, hacked off his tail with his knife, and is standing very proudly holding his trophy. So how do we, despite images like these or including images like these, how do we have a conversation? How do we move from an emotive conversation into an inclusive and practical one? And I'm genuinely asking you this question. So a couple of years ago, the internet was flooded with stories about a Texan who paid $350,000 to shoot a black rhino in Namibia. And those stories were not about $350,000, wow, what can we do for conservation in Namibia with $350,000? Those stories largely led to death threat after death threat after death threat for that Texan, as well as the people who sold him the license for that hunt. I was living in Africa at the time I started doing this work on trophy hunting, and I'd seen images like these. There were hunters around me, but I didn't know anything about hunting. That I know of, I had never met a hunter. I didn't grow up around hunters. It just wasn't part of my life. I didn't really know anything about it. So I started doing some research on it. And I was hearing from people, oh, well, those hunters, they're a different breed. And it turns out that that's actually kind of true. And not genetics, though maybe, I don't know. I'm not a geneticist and I didn't study that part of it. But it turns out that 70, 80, 90%, depending on the feature that you're looking at, 70, 80, 90% of hunters are totally happy to hunt in areas with no scenery whatsoever. Overgrazed, full of livestock walking through, people coming through and chopping down firewood, tsetse flies, doesn't matter. They just don't care. Political instability, who cares about that? And so you think about Africa, political instability is probably its middle name. And so, one example is looking at Zimbabwe. At the onset of the land seizures in 2000, ecotourism bookings dropped overnight 75%, and I think that's a conservative estimate. In some places where I was living, it was about 100, well, it was 100%. Ecotourism photographic safari bookings dropped, did I say that the right way? 75%. Hunting bookings dropped 12%. They have guns, right? What do they care? So because of those differences, we get a picture like this. So what this graph is showing you is in sub-Saharan Africa, in all of the countries that allow hunting, you have the land area encompassed by national parks on your left. And then you have, which is just over 1 million kilometers square. So that's, is that 250 million acres? Is that order of magnitude right? Whatever, it's a lot of land. All we're talking about here is the comparison. So we have national parklands, which we discussed if you were at the Nature Needs Half session. A lot of these are paper parks. There are not enough resources to go around to manage these areas effectively. They're just, they're being poached. It's a problem. These hunting lands, now 22% more land is encompassed in hunting lands than in all the national parks together. So that's about 1.3 kilometers square. And so if you practice decision science, you can look at this as an objective. Your objective might be to increase the land available for ecosystem processes or biodiversity or whatever it might be, and hunting is one alternative to get there. And so if it's not hunting, then fine by me, but what is it? What is that other land use that justifies wildlife as the primary land use, justifies nature as the primary thing here that does not exclude people? It doesn't, there are, like I said, livestock walking through, people cutting down firewood. I mean, this is people living with wildlife in a way that they feel good about it. And they feel good about it because there's value. And so here's an example of lack of value. So I was living in Kenya at the time that I started this work, and I was working on large carnivore conservation and carnivores, people living with carnivores, and talking to the elders, they would talk about the old days when, like high wildlife densities and jobs and all of these kinds of things. And the numbers have been coming out over time. The latest numbers came out just last year in 2016, showing that there's been, on average, a 68% decline in wildlife numbers since the hunting ban went in place in 1977. And so depending on the species you're talking about, it could be 90-some%, but on average, 68%. And that is largely attributed to wildlife not having value. People don't care. They're going and destroying, habitat, whatever it might be. Wildlife doesn't have value. And we've seen this in many countries. There have often been temporary bans on hunting put in place, maybe for a couple of years, maybe for a particular species. And immediately you see wildlife populations poaching on the rise, wildlife populations declining. The ban is lifted, wildlife populations expand again. So okay, some of you might say, no, can the conservation needs of many outweigh the few? If we look at hunting as a viable alternative, how do we engage in that conversation? And I went to the communication and science session yesterday, hoping to figure out how to do that. Is it a communication strategy? How can you get past images like the ones I showed you that really don't fare well for hunting as a conservation tool? How can we do that and include all the stakeholders who share those natural resources? How can we include them in that conversation to talk about this, to talk about hunting as a conservation tool? Thank you.